Welcome back to Data Faces, the podcast that explores human stories behind data, analytics, and AI. I'm your host, David Sweenor, founder of Tiny Tech Guides. Today, I am super excited to be joined with Jawwad Rasheed. He's financial service transformation at Alteryx. Jawwad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
Jawwad brings, so much experience in transforming financial operations through analytics and AI. He helps organizations really bridge the gap between traditional finance and modern data-driven approaches. So today we're going to explore how analytics and AI are really reshaping the finance function. We're going to discuss some of the challenges that Jawwad's seen and maybe some insights about the future of this in the finance function. So Jawwad, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what you're up to over at Alteryx?
Absolutely. So my background, I've spent my life predominantly in financial services, and within that spectrum, there's lots of things that many FinServs would like to do, and more often than not, in recent years, a lot of that has been down to driving some level of change with technology at the forefront of how people and resources can best come together to move finance forward. My life has very much worked cross-functional, though I focus predominantly, let's say, within the finance spectrum. So the tags finance transformation are things that I've brought with me in Alteryx, and my role at Alteryx is to help shape our proposition within that domain of the Office of Finance. But unsurprisingly, it's not a single-sided domain. We work very much cross-functionally in all enterprises we speak to. We often find finance at the crossroads, but you think about the conversations that we have with risk, treasury, procurement, sales, marketing. That suite really comes together quite nicely when you look at some of the technology capabilities that many are looking to strive for. Been at Alteryx about 3 years, and very keen to share some of the things I'm seeing in the market and the way forward as well.
Well, I appreciate that, Jawwad. I mean, you have a wealth of experience. I think you're formerly at EY, was it? I can't recall, but finance function historically they've had so much data, and some people they say they've been insights poor. So really, two questions: why is this? They seem to be primed to be data driven, and how are sort of modern analytics and AI perhaps changing this dynamic?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's probably two dimensions to answer that well. One is, where has finance come from as a function? And the second is, what has technology done along that journey to also help act as a catalyst and help shape what finance could do? So let's go back 25, 30 years, if any of us on the call can remember what that was like, but let's imagine that we can.
I can, Jawwad. You see the gray beard here. I certainly can.
I can remember it just about as well, but let me kind of paint a picture of what that past may have looked like. So finance historically has been the controller, consolidator, compliance-led function, the one that manages costs, that does all the things to get the numbers right, keeps books and records in order. That's been a stereotype that finance has had to bear and continues to bear as it moves on into the decades to come. The question really is, well, what's changed and how has finance changed in the last 15, 20 years, and where then is it going? So the big change has been not just the need to be a controller and consolidator and manager of cost and compliance and those things, but really become a cognitive agent. And that's an additional C that you can add along to that list. And what does that actually mean in practice? It means having the right capabilities, the resources, the tech and everything else to be able to look at data sets, to be able to look at complex data sets and improve the analytical capability for business and strategic decision making. The reason that's come about, the reason why finance has moved in that direction, is unsurprisingly the competitive environment that we're in means it's much harder to find an edge, and it's much harder to think about how businesses can play a much active role alongside finance to do that best. So the role that's really grown is the role of the finance business partner, the finance representative that sits in the business or works alongside the business to drive revenue growth, not just look at the cost and the control elements, which are equally important, but really be at the forefront of how can we grow the enterprise and the business. So we've seen that shift, that kind of growth, we can call it that, in capabilities, not just for financial accounting and financial operations, but much more management reporting, giving information to people to be able to make decisions. That's happened because we've had a huge spurge in data, information is vastly available, and that responsibility has kind of been shifted a lot to the finance professionals. The other side to that is then what's happened in the world of analytics and AI and automation. So again, let's go back 15, 20 years. What we've seen is the traditional model where a finance professional would raise a request to IT, to a data engineer and architect to define pipelines, curate the data, prepare the data, send the request back into finance. That model has been disrupted by the rise of hyper-automation, by intelligent automation solutions, where those capabilities are now sitting within finance. So finance analysts are becoming data analysts in their own realm. And what that means is IT can manage more intricate data pipelines and more complex requests. That adoption of those low-code solutions is great. It means that there's more things that finance professionals can do themselves, but it also means that the need for data scientists and analysts hasn't gone away. They just do much more complex stuff. When you bring those together, that opportunity is still huge. Like, what can we do with the vast amount of information that we have to remain competitive, to be more forward-looking, to be far more predictive in terms of what we can do and where we can take the business, not just being the number checker on itself.
Okay, that's quite interesting. You said a couple really, really fascinating things. This notion of cognitive agents. So I'm hearing that finance leaders are, maybe moving from historically sitting on the bench to really maybe coaching the game, to use a poor sports analogy. And then the other thing I'm hearing is this rise of self-service analytics. Does that introduce more risk to a company? I spend a lot of time thinking and discussing AI, and specifically generative AI, which makes up things all the time. But now if you have finance professionals that maybe used to talk to IT people that would send them a report, get data, what have you, and maybe they're operating in spreadsheets, does it change the risk profile, or do you think it's the same? They're getting to it faster. They don't have to wait on somebody else.
As ever, it's a balancing act, and I think this is an organizational decision on where does that balance lie in terms of freedom that they give, in this instance, finance professionals, to information and the governance control that you need to manage that successfully. So you're never going to have a situation where you would open up all information to all people and all parties, right? And the concept that there is certain information that certain people can own will still be maintained, and certain controls and checks still need to be in order, so that at any point in time, the position and the performance of a company can be assessed easily. Though you've got to balance that with, well, if you don't provide that level of access and you don't provide that level of assurance to people that know the information the best, what are you missing out on? And typically the what are you missing out on is huge opportunity that means that those requests, as I mentioned previously, get clogged up more in the IT bucket.
Right.
Now, the pace in which the industry, all industries have moved in the last 10, 15 years has far surpassed the rate at which change can be managed in organizations. So unless you have some concept of being more self-serve, you are going to be further left behind if you end up with a much more waterfall approach to managing requests. So that's the real model that's shifted. That's the change in the operating model, is not to have this send request and come back and give me a response. It's, we need to work in a more agile manner. We're finding that IT sometimes actually sits within finance. So we have, IT domains as part of finance rather than outside. So we can morph those boundaries. We can morph those management lines into one.
Okay. All right. So we need a governance framework, and I love that. You said, don't be left behind. If you have this ticket system, you're never going to catch up. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the role of leadership, Jawwad. I mean, you've led countless transformation initiatives. What are the biggest sort of misconceptions that finance leaders have about implementing analytics in the function?
Yeah, I think there's many. The ones that I think resonate, come to mind the most, are statements like, we need to get the data in a very good state before we think about analytics. And if we go again if we go back to where we're coming from and kind of what the future holds, there will never be a perfect state where information is perfect for us to then consider the analytics that we can derive from it. The imperfect state will have to exist, and that shouldn't be a blocker to be able to do more with the information that's currently available. The reason that is the notion of finance doesn't have to always go down to the single dollar value to drive certain decisions. If you think about a group function, What they
Right.
need is assurance on the direction that they're taking. So you can have a margin of plus minus 3-4% to be able to still make the right decision in the course of action.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that therefore you need everything down to the nth degree perfect in order to make that decision. You need directional views. So there is this old adage that we need to get everything right in order before we can think about analytics. If anything, having the right initiatives to have a cultural shift where people understand the importance of analytics, and that's very much aligned to corporate strategies, hierarchy of KPIs, because we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If they understand that importance, then they'll surface the issues with the data in the process. They'll surface what's wrong with it when they say, hang on, this outcome doesn't make sense. So use that as a catalyst, don't use it as a blocker. I think the other things are thinking that there will naturally be more advanced understanding if we get deeper analytics. So granularity analytics doesn't always lead to something that improves or advances the organization. It doesn't always do that.
Right.
It very much depends on what the organization believes are its most important set of metrics and KPIs, and almost like a driver tree or set of hierarchies that define those KPIs for the rest of the organization. So an organization might say the three most important things to me are revenue growth, managing my cost income ratio, and minimizing P&L sensitivity, volatility.
Mm-hmm.
And beneath that, you might have a number of other metrics and drivers associated. So if an organization is serious about that strategy, you'll say, well, what are the analytics that I need to give me information that I'm managing that against my corporate strategy? And what's the next level below? What's the next level below? What's the next below? That's how driver trees work. So it doesn't always mean that you have to have everything down to a very minute level of granularity to move forward. It really depends on how you're defining your corporate strategy, your key set of metrics, and what the hierarchy looks like. I think the two other things become really important are the belief that somehow there is a one-off fix that's going to fix everything. And once we have that in place, then we're good to go and we're good for the future. The real, secret sauce is to define a mechanism by which your reality is continually evolving, so that as your business changes, you have a method internally to adapt to that change with a varying degree of information analytics support. So any level of change or implementing analytics need to be thought of as a continually evolving mechanism and process in the organization, because businesses are never static and your direction changes and your metrics change and your targets change. So you need something internally as an operating model to adapt. And a lot of that comes down to the cultural shift in acknowledging what the finance team needs to do and what's important to them to make that happen. So analytics are all good, but unless there's a fundamental shift in the notion that our organization is incentivized to let our people come back to us with some interesting information that might help us, then you're not going to lead to that level of change of continually evolving and growing as an organization. So the cultural element becomes hugely important. Sure. So lots of different things, I think, in that bag, but those are some of the things that I often see as stumbling blocks.
Yeah, that's super fascinating to me. In that, you met this notion of having a directional view. You don't have it down to the exact cent. If you're, in some cases you do for sure, but you're trying to help the business achieve its objectives, and so just having that directional view, I think, is wise advice for folks out there. So let's talk about how we get there. There's this notion of the last mile of analytics, and we have analytics and turning insights into action. So how do you bridge this gap for CFOs?
Yeah, that gap of I've got some information, or what do I actually do with it, right? So I think it comes, we'll go back to the previous question and talk about the pitfalls. And I think the pitfalls lie in trying to work left to right. The left to right is saying, I've got some information, I'm going to derive some insights, and I'm going to work out what to do with it. So the better course of action is to think the right to left, saying, what are the 10 decisions that I need to make? What are the 10 questions I'm looking to answer? How does that start at the top of the house, and how does that extend across the organization? Knowing what those are, knowing what those actions are, will help define those KPIs and metrics, and then help confirm, do I have the data, or are the data gaps against those particular requirements? Assessing that availability of data and then the process and technology to support, also means it may uncover some of the organizational inefficiencies. Are you set up correctly? Do you have the right people to deliver against those metrics? So working the right to left is usually the answer here in terms of how do you turn insight into action. It's not the last mile. It's the first thing you need to consider. Saying, give me the 10, 15, 20 things that I want to answer. And how do I make sure I've got everything set up in order for me to do that effectively? I did this exact piece of work actually for, I can't mention the bank, but let's say it's one of the global banks, works across every region and border. They do everything, corporate lending, wholesale banking, retail, wealth management, and the rest. And their group finance team had this exact ask to A, define a series of metrics, B, produce them in some form of visualization, but also have the capability to drill into the information more and define further insight. So you've got almost the 80-20 concept here. You've got I've got 15, 20 things I need to absolutely know. I need some information. And there's also a bunch of stuff that we probably don't know at this point in time, but will uncover having drilled a little bit more into the 80%, the things that we really want to drive. That will lead into a number of other threads, and we're happy to explore that. That's the notion that you need. It doesn't need to be completely structured saying we're only going to answer 20 things. It needs to have the flexibility and the thread to do more. And that's, I talked about the evolving model, having analytics continually on. That's the kind of internal operating model that's needed to maintain that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I always, you don't want to do analytics, I think, for the sake of doing analytics. So I love that notion of what are the business decisions that we need to make and then work backwards from there. Do you think businesses have a handle on what decisions they want to make? Like, what's the state of planning and leadership? Sometimes I see it all over the map. When I talk to customers, would love to hear your perspective on that.
I think the tension here lies between how do the businesses align to enterprise strategy and group strategy? So if you're a business, typically you have your own targets around growth and P&L and how you maintain costs, etc. And that can conflict sometimes with how this stitches together with the overall enterprise strategy. And businesses sometimes run in their own direction and become almost too powerful within organizations. And we find that a lot. And those leaders have a path to grow and may go into leadership positions of the organization themselves.
Sure.
In order to maintain that, you do need a strong leadership at the top. And I think this comes down to saying, well, what are the guardrails that we're going to put on the business in order for them to have enough room to grow successfully, but in the I guess with the right checks and balances, so they're aligned to our corporate strategy, number one. The second is to probably maintain some healthy internal competition to do so. So I find that the model of incentivizing the businesses to be the pioneer, to do something, is hugely powerful when you give them the information at hand and saying, hey, there's a lot more that you can surface. Come back to me with the ideas. I'm going to empower you to do so. The self-serve nature of what we're talking about earlier obviously helps do that. Strong leadership is required at the top. This is probably the starting point, but I think the right boundaries and parameters need to be set for the business to work in, and the right incentive models need to be built in for those business leaders and finance leaders support to help them along there. And I think that's a healthy balance, just maintaining that kind of internal competition and wanting to be the pioneer to show to everyone else how wonderful things you can do with information.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of potential there. So we can't have a podcast without talking about AI. At least I can't. So how do you see, AI impacting really the role of, the finance function, the analysts involved, over the next, I was going to say 3 years, but I don't even think we can see past next week right now with the state of the rate of change. So how do you see this unfolding?
So that's always the $1 million question. How's it going to unfold? I think to answer that question, we have to look at, well, where is finance going again? And then how does that impact the kind of talent and roles that exist within finance? So let's imagine a more nirvana state. The nirvana state of finance may be something on the lines of, we don't need cyclical nature of processes. And what do I mean by that? Organizations and public organizations, for example, disclose their numbers monthly, quarterly, annually. And there's a lot of effort that goes into that. Actuals and forecasts take a lot of time to assemble. there will come a point, and I'm confident that there will come a point where things like your actuals and your forecasts can be produced instantly on demand, and therefore traditional cycles don't become relevant.
Okay.
That kind of distinction between operational and analytical data begins to disappear, and finance organizations are currently, trying to meet the demands of cyclical information, but really the speed in which that information is needed by investors, by stakeholders, is going to speed up. So the nirvana state is, there is no concept of closing your books. You're just always live, and at any point in time, you can get a finger on the pulse on where the organization is. Imagine that is the direction that we're moving in. It's almost like, I guess the term continuous accounting is, comes to mind when you think about that. The talent that you need in finance doesn't become the people that bring, crunch, and assemble all of that to produce some output. It becomes almost like the human interface between machines and the owner of, let's say, models that may be responsible to produce some level of outcome. In order to do that, you still need to be a specialist in your domain. There's no way that you're going to be a review and a checker unless you understand what the output is and how it's actually got there. So having transparency of information that's passed through machines and sources and leads to an outcome, there is a role for the finance analyst to be a specialist in the machine, the model, or anything else that's been used, an intermediary, to gain assurance on the output. Doesn't mean they're crunching themselves, it means they become almost an owner of a system or a model or an application. And that continuous accounting concept, I think, emphasizes that role, because at any point in time, a direction may come in from investors or stakeholders saying, I want to know X, Y, or Z. You need to be instantly on point to be able to respond to those external requests, regular requests, investor requests. I think that, combined with premium placed on data scientists and analysts and storytellers into finance, will also very much come to life. So the continued morphing of the data scientist role within finance and the blending of those roles to bring in finance SMEs with data science knowledge will become huge. There'll be huge demand and premium placed on that. Why? Because, again, as you increase the level of self-serve, there's more that finance can do, even now, to double down on that use of hyper-automation, intelligent automation, to bring that, advanced data science capabilities back into the finance domain. And then you kind of think about where else could the finance roles go? I think that tag of data officer alongside finance officer will become a lot more prevalent.
Okay.
So we might find, for example, the CFOs become CFDOs, for example, Chief Finance and Data Officer. Ooh. In the same way that data officers and information officers are sitting a lot closer together, that whole realm of the C-suite might suddenly morph into something that's far more hands-on, joined at the hip, etc., even more than it is today. More to the point where some of those C-suite roles become morphed into one. Technical literacy will be high as ever, as I think we know, and I think we will definitely be considering a leaner organization. But that leaner organization will lend itself, I think, more to the advancements that you have in becoming far more prescriptive and predictive in terms of where the organization could go, which lends itself to the analytic capabilities that need to be doubled down on in finance.
I love this concept. You mentioned this human in the loop, essentially, in the finance function. Now, if we play this forward, you're obviously, there's going to be more automation. There's going to be more AI, more generative AI doing things. So when we're doing these things at scale, and we have, millions of things going on in these large enterprises, how does the human know what to focus on? How do they know if there's one hallucination that they don't catch, it ruins all the downstream activities from that? How is one to handle that? It's a big concern of mine, but love your perspective on that.
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot, particularly in the financial services spectrum, for reasons that have existed in that world for decades. And let me kind of explain that a little bit further. So a lot of the ask that you would need to provide assurance on, particularly, let's say, if you're a bank, is getting comfort on a model that's used to, let's say, produce a credit score or produce some kind of significant weighting to a particular portfolio that you're managing. Now, all these exposures that you are running, for example, in your machines need to have some level of assurance around the model that's being built. And these are subject to external scrutiny by regulators that have been for years. The level of scrutiny that you face is very extreme, where you need to explain all the algorithms and the mechanism by which a number is being produced. If you consider what that means in the realm today around model governance and model ownership, what we're asking is for finance specialists to also have domain knowledge in how you build a model, what that model is, and it could be a very complex model, for example, an LLM or a fine-tuned model that's specific to the domain. Know how it works to gain assurance on the outcome, so that if there is a potential error around what that outcome is, they can investigate through a chain of thought to understand, well, what's led to that point. The only way you're going to do that is if you are part of the notion to help build and train that model in the first place. You can't suddenly become a owner without having the mechanics at hand to know what's gone into the construct of that. So finance analysts have essentially become owners of important AI models and other models that help produce some outcome, and will face a huge level of scrutiny if they want to go down that road on being able to explain how an input with some complex algorithm led to an output and knowing where the potential errors may lie. That concept is a fundamental shift in where we are today. That moves the finance analyst much more into the data scientist realm. And that's where I think those data science capabilities become hugely valuable for finance leaders. It's the morphing of the two, which becomes a powerful concept, and that's where a lot of the talent demands, I think, will lie.
You know, it's interesting though, Jawwad, just to push on that a little bit. You know, I think it's fairly straightforward if we have an algorithm that deals with numbers. You know, it could be a forecast model, it could be regret, whatever it is. It can be very complex. But when we talk about, you know, an LLM, which is, you know, ostensibly trained on the world's data, you're never going to really know what's in there. And only maybe the largest organizations, they might build their own and know exactly what's in there. But for the rest of the world, you know, they're going to grab one from somewhere, a provider, open source, whatever. So like, can you ever truly know? So does this just raise the amount of governance we need to have within these things?
Can you ever know? The answer to that is, it depends on the transparency you have around the chain of thought that's led to an outcome and whether that can be explained with the model. You're always going to be susceptible, unless you, let's say, build your own internal model with your own training data sets and the rest. You're always going to have some level of risk for a, let's say, open source model that is freely available in the market, that you don't truly understand the full complexities around all the tokenization that's gone into produce, let's say, transformation from an input to an output. Absolutely. And the multiple parameters that you do so. The only way that you can think about improving that level of certainty is to think about smaller domain models that you can have in potentially larger volume that are managed locally within the organization with key model owners, that are built bottom up with trained data that's used by the organization, where you go through that learning of testing the model, doing all the regression tests, and proving the outcomes to improve the level of certainty. I think we're seeing that shift already in the market already, where more organizations are investing in developing their own domain-specific models for very specific tasks, which are cheaper to run, don't invest in the high cost and all those kind of things. But in order to do that successfully, I think you need to think about this completely bottoms up. And the low-code solutions, I think, play a role in this. I mean, we can talk about the actual open source platforms like your TensorFlows that are hugely critical to do model development, but also you just got to get the training data right in the first place. So this same question, though, is posed by very simple models as well, as you said. You know, regression models get huge scrutiny in the market, right? Because they're saying, well, how do you prove to me that the linearity that you're proposing here is what it says it is for the next 3 to 5 years, right? That scrutiny won't go away. I think the scrutiny will then be doubled down on those people that are developing and owning those models. I think that's where the burden lies for the future of finance. Okay.
All right. So maybe we have time for one last question. So, you know, are there other technologies or trends that you think will have a significant impact on finance analytics over the next, I don't know, few years, 5 years?
I think if we talk about finance as a whole, not just analytics, then let's look at where finance is going. So the concept of touchless transactions, I think, as I mentioned, will definitely continue and double down. One of the things that we're probably going to see more of is more competition with major players to provide ERP solutions, and obviously they're moving much more to hyperscalers through cloud-based ERP automation. We're seeing a lot more microservices and applications that sit on top of that offer some level of not competition, but let's say add-ons, which many companies are going down. So I think the need to be flexible with cloud-based ERP solutions, the extension of microservices will definitely be a trend that continues. I think we haven't seen enough of real practical applications of distributed ledger technology and what that means to have decentralized ledgers, aka the blockchain kind of revolution. We haven't really seen that come into life enough. And there's much more that can be done still to get the certainty of transactions that are validated and verified through distributed ledgers, decentralized systems. So hopefully that's something that will really come into fruition now, particularly with the hyperscalers that we have. And I still don't think we've done enough, even with the existing kind of hyper automation, intelligent automation applications that we have out there. You go to every organizations that I'm sure we both speak to have only really kind of scratched the surface here, and are still struggling to be able to really take a lot of the rule-based, commoditized, and standardized processes in finance, automate them in a way that is as touchless as possible. There's so much more that could be done just in that realm. So yeah, what does the future look like? We haven't done enough of what we said we were going to do in the last 10 years.
Right.
There's a number of big ticket items out there that haven't really come into full play and fruition that, again, we need to explore and make practical use of. And as we do so, we're getting a lot of natural kind of hype and interest and excitement around what the future holds with AI agents and chatbots and the rest and everything else of that whole. So the bag is full of goodies. Prioritization is important, and need to start bottoms up here.
Yeah, and so Jawwad, for the finance professionals that are listening to this, just final thoughts and advice. They're looking at this technology landscape. They might be having difficulty understanding where to start. What advice would you offer them, and how can they get a hold of you?
So, what advice? We're seeing curriculums change in finance. And back in my day, when you went through your accounting qualifications or CFAs and SEAMs and the rest, the path was kind of quite clear. You become accountant, you've got a chartered accountant, you think about the different roles that you could play in finance, and it was almost quite a defined career. And now that kind of defined career is, I think, very positively being challenged by doing more exciting things within the finance domain. And we're seeing much more of the data-led skills and system-led skills morph with the finance specialism. So I think the one advice really is, don't lose the need. If there is that kind of fear that your knowledge is going to be eradicated. In order to become the finance specialist, you will also need to think about how you become that middle person, almost the human middleware to technology, right? And that's hugely important if the direction that we're moving in is something that's far more seamless and touchless when it comes to finance. It's almost finance as a service as opposed to finance as a function, right? That's an important notion. Right. So yeah, I think be completely aware of the changes around you. Important to have the foundational skills and qualifications still. It's really wonderful that we can accelerate the way that we get those foundational skills these days with all of the resources and mediums available to us. But understand the role that you have to be more of an agent of change and an ambassador for finance services, rather than sitting in a functional line that sits in finance.
Okay. Well, Jawwad, as always, this has been an enlightening and informative, delightful conversation. I appreciate you coming on the show, and I hope our listeners enjoy it. So thank you.
Great to be on. Thank you, David.
Cheers.